Pastor David Thompson's voice carried across the community center as he pointed directly at the Virgin Mary statue. The annual interfaith gathering had been peaceful until this moment, but something in David's eyes had shifted from theological disagreement to contempt. Catholic parishioners from St. Augustine's sat frozen as their respected Protestant neighbor raised his hand toward the blessed figure. Margaret O'Brien clutched her rosary tighter. She had known David for 15 years, watched him build Grace Fellowship from 12 families to 200. Never had she seen this hardness in his face, this deliberate cruelty in his gesture as he approached the statue that had been her grandmother's. David's words came out sharp and calculated. He spoke of idolatry, of false worship, but his tone carried mockery that made even his own congregation shift uncomfortably. When he reached toward the statue's face with obvious disrespect, the room held its breath. Then silence fell like a curtain. David's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. He tried again, pressing his hand to his throat, eyes widening with confusion. The silence stretched impossibly long as 200 people watched their eloquent pastor struggle with lips that formed words his voice could not carry. Margaret whispered a prayer, while David's wife, Susan, rushed forward. But the man who had never lacked for words stood mute before the statue he had sought to diminish. Susan Thompson reached her husband's side as whispers rippled through the community center. David's face had drained of color, his hands still pressed against his throat as if he could physically force sound to emerge. Dr. Martinez from the local clinic pushed through the crowd, his medical training overriding the stunned atmosphere that had settled over the gathering. The Catholic families remained seated, their shock giving way to something approaching awe. Father Rodriguez rose slowly from his chair, his weathered hands folded in prayer as he watched the Protestant pastor who moments before had been mocking their most sacred devotion. The Virgin Mary statue stood unchanged, her painted eyes seeming to hold more compassion than judgment. David gestured frantically to his wife, mouthing words she couldn't understand. His congregation from Grace Fellowship looked between their silent pastor and the statue he had been denouncing. Elder Jim Matthews cleared his throat uncomfortably, unsure whether to approach or retreat from the scene unfolding before them all. Susan's voice broke the heavy quiet. She asked if anyone had called an ambulance, her words echoing in the space her husband's voice had occupied just minutes earlier. But even as she spoke of medical help, something in the room felt beyond the reach of earthly intervention. The silence surrounding David seemed absolute, selective, supernatural. Dr. Martinez examined David's throat with practiced efficiency, his penlight revealing nothing unusual in the pastor's vocal cords or airways. David could swallow normally, could cough when prompted, but when he attempted to speak, even a whisper, absolute silence emerged. The physician's confusion deepened as every physical function appeared normal, except the one that had defined David's ministry for 2 decades. Margaret O'Brien approached cautiously, her rosary still wound between her fingers. She spoke softly to Susan, offering their family's prayers, her voice carrying none of the triumph some might have expected. Instead, her weathered face showed genuine concern mixed with unmistakable recognition that something sacred had occurred in their midst. Father Rodriguez stepped forward, his presence somehow calming the electric tension that had gripped the room. He suggested they all pray together, not in victory or defeat, but for understanding and healing. Several Protestant families joined the circle that formed spontaneously around David and Susan, denominational barriers dissolving in the face of mystery that transcended theological differences. David's eyes moved from face to face, seeing compassion where he had expected judgment. His attempt to mock had been met not with divine wrath, but with a silence that seemed to demand reflection rather than punishment. The statue remained unchanged, but everything else had shifted in ways none of them fully comprehended. Sunday morning arrived with crushing weight for Grace Fellowship. David sat in his study, staring at sermon notes that now seemed meaningless without his voice to deliver them. Elder Jim Matthews had volunteered to lead worship, but the congregation needed their pastor, needed the familiar cadence of David's preaching that had guided them through countless trials over 15 years. Susan brought him coffee with shaking hands. 3 days of absolute vocal silence had taken its toll on their household. Their teenage daughter Amy had stopped bringing friends over, embarrassed by her father's condition and the whispers that followed their family through town. Even at the grocery store, conversations stopped when the Thompsons appeared, replaced by meaningful glances and hushed speculation. David attempted to write his thoughts on paper, but even his written words felt hollow without the passion that had always driven his ministry. His theological certainties, once proclaimed with such confidence, now seemed fragile in the face of unexplainable silence. He found himself questioning not just what had happened, but why his heart had harbored such contempt for beliefs that brought others genuine comfort. The phone rang constantly with concerned parishioners, medical referrals, and reporters who had somehow learned about the incident. Susan fielded each call, while David watched helplessly, his ministry slipping away one unanswered conversation at a time. Dr. Patricia Wells from the Regional Medical Center completed her examination with the same bewildered expression David had seen on every specialist's face. His vocal cords showed no damage, no inflammation, no physical explanation for his complete inability to produce sound. She recommended a psychiatric evaluation, suggesting the silence might be psychological, but David knew the truth ran deeper than medical science could reach. Amy confronted him that evening with tears streaming down her face. She had overheard classmates calling her father crazy, claiming he was faking his condition for attention. The girl who had once proudly introduced herself as the pastor's daughter now dreaded going to school, carrying shame that belonged to him but wounded her innocent heart. Susan found David in their bedroom that night, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She held him while he wept soundlessly, his grief pouring out in ways his voice could not express. For the first time since the incident, David felt the full weight of his actions not just on himself, but on the family who loved him unconditionally. His Bible lay open to passages about pride and humility, verses he had preached countless times without truly understanding their personal application. Now, stripped of the voice that had been his identity, David began to hear God speaking through the very silence that had become his prison. 2 weeks into his silence, David made a decision that surprised even Susan. He walked to St. Augustine's Catholic Church during their evening prayer service, his heart pounding as he approached the building he had once criticized from his pulpit. Margaret O'Brien looked up from her pew as he entered, her eyes widening with recognition and something approaching hope. Father Rodriguez paused in his prayers as David moved slowly down the aisle toward the altar where an identical Virgin Mary statue stood in peaceful repose. The same painted eyes, the same gentle expression that had witnessed his mockery and somehow responded with supernatural correction rather than destruction. David knelt before the statue, his silence now feeling less like punishment and more like preparation. Around him, the Catholic faithful continued their evening prayers, their voices creating a harmony he had never allowed himself to appreciate. Margaret's whispered Hail Marys blended with other voices in Latin and English, creating a tapestry of devotion that his theological pride had once dismissed as meaningless ritual. For the first time since losing his voice, David attempted to pray not for restoration, but for forgiveness. The words formed silently in his heart, addressed not only to God but to the community he had wounded and the traditions he had mocked. His tears fell onto the worn carpet where countless others had knelt seeking grace. Margaret O'Brien approached David after the prayer service ended, her weathered hands carrying a small wooden cross. She pressed it into his palm with gentle firmness, her voice barely above a whisper as she told him about her grandmother's faith during the Great Depression. The cross had belonged to a woman who had prayed through poverty, loss, and persecution, yet never lost her trust in divine mercy. David clutched the cross as Margaret explained how his mockery had wounded her, but also how his silent presence tonight had begun healing something deeper than hurt feelings. She spoke of forgiveness not as weakness, but his strength that required grace beyond human capability. Her words carried weight his own sermons had never achieved, born from genuine suffering transformed by authentic faith. Father Rodriguez joined them, his presence calm and reassuring. He suggested David might find peace through service rather than words, offering him opportunity to help with the church's food pantry and community outreach. The priest's invitation came without conditions or demands for public apology, simply extending grace to a man whose pride had been thoroughly broken. Walking home under starlight, David felt something shift inside his chest. The silence that had imprisoned him for weeks now seemed less like punishment and more like preparation for a different kind of ministry, one built on humility rather than eloquence. David's first morning at the Catholic food pantry began before sunrise. He sorted canned goods alongside Maria Santos, a grandmother who had been volunteering for 30 years despite her own family struggles. She worked with quiet efficiency, never mentioning his identity or his condition, simply accepting his presence as another pair of hands willing to serve those in need. Elder Jim Matthews arrived unexpectedly during the morning distribution, his face showing surprise at finding his pastor bagging groceries for families from both Protestant and Catholic congregations. David met his gaze with calm acceptance, no longer ashamed of serving in ways that required no voice. Jim lingered, watching his formerly eloquent pastor communicate through gentle gestures and patient attention to each person's needs. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman with limited English, approached David with obvious recognition. She touched his hand gently and spoke in rapid Spanish to Maria, who translated with tears in her eyes. The woman was praying for his healing, not because she demanded his voice return, but because she wanted his heart to find peace regardless of whether he ever spoke again. David found himself weeping as he handed her the bag of groceries, overwhelmed by grace from someone who had every reason to judge him harshly. In her weathered smile, he glimpsed the face of mercy he had spent years preaching about but never truly understood. 3 weeks of silent service had transformed David in ways his family could see but not fully comprehend. Amy noticed her father's face had lost the hard edges that had developed over recent years, replaced by gentleness she remembered from her childhood. Susan watched him read scripture with new hunger, not preparing sermons, but seeking personal understanding of grace he had proclaimed but never truly received. During his evening walk past the community center, where everything had changed, David encountered a group of teenagers spray painting graffiti on the building's sidewall. Instead of the angry confrontation his old self would have initiated, he simply stood watching until the young vandals noticed him. His silent presence carried more authority than shouting would have achieved. One teenager, recognizing the mute pastor from local gossip, challenged David with mocking questions about divine punishment and religious hypocrisy. David responded by pulling out cleaning supplies from the nearby maintenance shed and beginning to scrub away the graffiti. His actions spoke louder than sermons, demonstrating repentance through humble work rather than defensive arguments. The teenagers gradually joined him, their mockery fading into awkward participation as they helped restore what they had damaged. By sunset, the wall was clean, and several young hearts had witnessed grace expressed through quiet example rather than loud proclamation. David walked home knowing his ministry had found its truest voice. Father Rodriguez proposed a joint community project that would bring both congregations together to restore the old community garden behind the Interfaith Center. David nodded eagerly when asked to participate, grateful for opportunity to build rather than tear down relationships between their churches. Elder Jim Matthews agreed to coordinate Protestant volunteers, recognizing how his pastor's transformation was healing divisions that had festered for years. Margaret O'Brien worked alongside David planting tomatoes and peppers, their shared labor creating conversation that transcended denominational boundaries. She told him about her late husband's friendship with Protestant neighbors, how faith had always been meant to unite rather than divide communities. David listened with his whole heart, learning more about genuine Christianity through her stories than he had absorbed in seminary. Susan brought Amy to help with the garden project. Watching her daughter interact naturally with Catholic families she had been taught to view as different. The teenager's easy acceptance of their new interfaith friendships showed David how his former prejudices had limited his family's experience of God's broader community. Amy laughed with children from St. Augustine's, her joy unencumbered by theological distinctions that had once seemed so important. As evening settled over their shared work, both congregations gathered for a simple meal prepared by volunteers from each church. David sat quietly among people who had become family through service, his silence no longer feeling like punishment, but like the peaceful foundation for deeper listening. On the fourth Sunday of his silence, David stood before his own congregation with a handwritten letter Elder Jim read aloud. The words spoke of David's journey from pride to humility, his recognition of how contempt had poisoned his ministry, and his gratitude for the Catholic community's forgiveness. He asked his Protestant family to join him in serving alongside their Catholic neighbors, building bridges instead of walls between their shared faith traditions. Several parishioners wept as Jim read David's confession of how his theological certainty had hardened into spiritual arrogance. The pastor who had once thundered against Catholic practices now humbly acknowledged the genuine devotion he had witnessed in their prayers and service. His written words carried more power than his most passionate sermons, born from authentic transformation rather than academic knowledge. Margaret O'Brien attended the service at David's invitation, sitting in the front pew as he attempted his first spoken words in over a month. His voice emerged as barely a whisper, rusty from disuse but carrying profound gratitude as he thanked her for showing him the face of Christ through her forgiveness. The simple phrase, "Thank you," Margaret, broke the silence that had held his voice captive for 31 days. Grace Fellowship erupted in tears and praise, witnessing not just the return of their pastor's voice, but the birth of his transformed heart that would serve both communities with newfound humility and love. 6 months later, David's ministry had become something entirely new. His sermons, delivered with a gentleness born from being broken and rebuilt by grace, drew visitors from neighboring towns who had heard about the pastor whose mockery was met with mercy. He preached now about unity rather than division, about the dangers of spiritual pride, and about finding God in the faces of those we might too quickly dismiss. The interfaith community garden flourished under care from both congregations, producing vegetables that fed dozens of local families regardless of their denominational affiliation. David worked the soil every Tuesday alongside Margaret, their friendship a living testament to forgiveness that transcended theological boundaries. Amy brought friends from school to help harvest, her natural joy in serving others reflecting the transformation that had touched their entire family. Susan often watched her husband from their kitchen window as he tended the garden where his heart had truly learned to grow. His voice had returned, but it carried different weight now, seasoned with humility and sweetened by genuine love for all God's children. The man who had once mocked what he didn't understand now spent his days building bridges between communities that had discovered their shared hunger for authentic faith. Every evening, David passed the Virgin Mary statue in the community center, no longer with contempt, but with quiet gratitude for the grace that had silenced his pride and taught his heart to truly speak. Have you ever experienced forgiveness that changed everything or witnessed someone's transformation through unexpected grace? Share your story of redemption in the comments below.